He said it like it was casual, like he was offering more mashed potatoes. She's joining us for Christmas dinner. Those 4 words landed in the room like a glass ornament dropped from a height. The lights on the tree flickered behind him, warm gold bulbs, the soft halo that's supposed to make everything look safe. And I smiled, because that's what polite wives do when the scene requires it. I set the last place card. I adjusted the napkin. My hands trembled so slightly, the way a calm person's voice trembles when they're holding a secret too big to hold alone. I am a Black wife. I live in an Atlanta suburb where our block knows each other's kids and their school zones, where porch lights burn late and casseroles are currency. I cook Sunday dinners and paint in the afternoons, and people trust me to be steady. Marcus, my husband of 7 years, knew that. He never expected me to be anything but steady. He had no idea how long I'd been carrying a storm. This is the story of how I detonated a lie, not in a movie theater fireworks way, in a slow, surgical way that left both rubble and startling, necessary clarity. I'm telling it because people like to think betrayal is a one-moment sting. It isn't. Betrayal is a series of small deceptions stitched into the ordinary fabric of life until the fabric betrays you. I'm telling it because that small, polite sentence, "She's joining us for Christmas dinner," was the last polite thing he ever said to me. Stay with me. This gets worse before it gets better. If you want to hear the whole truth, subscribe. I remember our 7th anniversary like it was a film still you can't stop staring at. We'd planned a quiet evening, my favorite linen dress, candles, because Marcus never learned that the cheapest thing you can buy to make a night feel special is a flame. Lamb roasted the exact way my grandmother taught me. The house smelt like rosemary and citrus. Outside, the winter wasn't yet the kind that freezes everything. It was a gentle cold that made the lights look richer. He left the table to get wine. The house was small enough that you could hear the kitchen cabinets close. My phone buzzed in my purse. A new message? A notification? I moved to pick it up unconsciously, like every married woman in the age of screens learns to do, half expecting a friend, a confirmation, something mundane. What I found wasn't mundane. Photos cropped in ways they shouldn't, messages that begin with endearments and then scatter into plans, names that were supposed to be past tense, present tense. The worst part wasn't the images or the words, it was the timestamps. They layered themselves across a period when I had been hollowed out. 2 months earlier, I had lost a pregnancy. I know now how jarring the world becomes when it carries 2 rhythms, the one you move through and the one you feel inside your chest. On the day of the miscarriage, he called my sister and asked, "Is she okay?" That, as if distance and false tenderness could make up for absence, he was not present. That absence felt like a deliberate omission, something that later would have a name: choice. I didn't scream. I folded my hands and told myself the story that keeps you from tearing down everything before you have a plan. I put the phone back in my purse. I finished the plate, swallowed a piece of lamb I barely tasted, and let Marcus bring in the wine. He kissed me in that way we reserve for cameras and parties, the practiced angle, and I smiled. That night, in the quiet after the candles burned low, I opened everything I could open without breaking the law. I scrolled with surgical attention, timestamps, patterns, names. I didn't invent anything. I found what there was. The word affair felt too vulgar and too small for the quiet architecture of what I discovered. This was less a blaze of passion and more a steady undercurrent of secrecy that had been flowing alongside our life together. You don't have to be dramatic to be devastated. The simplest facts can carve out a canyon. He'd been messaging Victoria Hawthorne. Victoria's name was a neat, old-fashioned thing, the kind of name that looks good on a therapist's business card. She'd once been part of his life before mine, an ex who lingered in photographs, in mutual friends, and now, in messages, she was a project and a consolation. She was also, as I would later discover, someone who presented herself as a pillar of family stability, therapist, engaged, the kind of woman people point to when they talk about doing the right thing. The timeline hurt in the particular places betrayals are designed to hurt. There were messages during the time I was physically unwell, messages on days he'd promised to be home and wasn't. The distance between the text and his body was a betrayal, I decided, of the worst kind. It arrived like a lie dressed in choreographed ordinary gestures. He had not only been with someone else, he had been absent when I needed him most. For 48 hours, I moved through the world like a person watching herself in a dream. I drove to the grocery store and could not remember why I'd gone. I sat in my car in the driveway after a PTA meeting and felt both furious and strangely calm, as if another brain had taken over the business of living while my own sat in a corner, gripping the pulpy part of a heart. I called my sister, Lauren. I told her I would be over. She didn't ask questions she was saving for me. She brought over chicken soup and a robe. We were raised to keep our composure while we prepare the next step. Maybe that's culture. Maybe it's survival. I called an attorney the third morning because sometimes the first act of dignity is to plan for inevitability. Vivian Porter's office smelled of coffee and books. She spoke to me without flinching. "Document everything," she said, not as a command, but as a map. "You do this right, you don't have to carry this forever." I didn't want to carry it. I wanted the story done. I hired Sam, a private investigator whose presence felt like the first adult thing I'd done since I discovered the messages. Sam was not in the movies. He did not have an eye patch. He arrived with a folder and a cup of coffee and asked, "How much do you want to know?" The answer was everything. He moved with a professional detachment that I envied. He took what I had, screenshots, dates, notes, and turned them into an architecture of proof. Photos where hands rested on thighs, receipts that suggested meetings rather than chance encounters. A social media exchange where Victoria, whose life was curated with therapist quotes and smiling engagement photos, slipped and revealed herself in other times. I did not indulge a bloodlust for cruelty. I was calculating, cold perhaps. That cold was fuel. I did what the hurt voice inside me told me to. I turned to the structures that can actually make a cheater feel the weight of their decision without me ever having to raise a hand. There are ethical choices inside revenge. I chose law, documentation, and public accountability. I did not call his workplace to scream. I did not assault his car. I filed copies. I cataloged. I photographed. I saw this as both an act of self-protection and a way to make sure this behavior could not continue to be invisible. If she claims to be a family therapist, I thought, and her ethics are performative, someone should know. It's worth saying plainly, I did not do anything illegal. I gathered evidence that could be gathered. I hired professionals who delivered verifiable materials. Vivian advised me on timing and options. Sam corroborated what my raw grief had already suspected. It was painstaking work, and each little item that proved their pattern was like a stone in a dam I was quietly building, not to flood anyone, but to reroute the stream of my life. Part of the strategy, and the part that hurt more than any of it, was patience. I had this instinct that people reveal who they are most plainly around the holidays. Holidays bring out the best and the worst of people. That's not dramatic, it's human. People relax and the masks slip. Marcus chose to invite Victoria over for Christmas, innocent enough on its face. Maybe he thought it would make him look magnanimous. Maybe he thought it would be a harmless gesture of closure. He misread me. In the weeks that followed our discovery, I learned to live a double life in a house that once felt like a sanctuary. I was the gracious hostess, the woman who answered yes when Marcus asked if everything was okay, who baked cookies for his office party, who wrote the holiday cards in a hand that looked practiced. I am not a natural actor. I am not a liar by inclination, but I had a kind of righteous deception to maintain. I wanted to watch him make the mistakes he'd been making without my collapse making everything sloppy and irretrievable. We reheated normalcy until it became unbearable. I saw the way Marcus softened when he thought no one was watching. I sat with him at professional events and smiled while plotting a future where his choices would not be able to hide behind our social niceties. The world around us carried on. Our neighborhood had its tree lighting, the kids went to school, and people would greet me with the same affection they always did. That kind of pretense becomes a corrosive thing. You are living, yet your life is altered at the base. In the middle of all that pretense, I made contact with Alex Ramos. Let me be clear, I did not ambush him at his engagement party or anything worthy of soap opera. I sent an anonymous message, truth framed tightly, evidence attached, because someone who is about to marry a woman who has been living two lives deserves to know the facts before he puts his name on a piece of paper. There was an ethical logic to it. If she was presenting herself as faithful and slated to become a husband's wife, Alex had a right to make his own choices. And if she was a professional who might be violating ethical boundaries with clients or while representing herself as a family-centered professional, someone should say something. Alex's response was shock and then confusion and then a slow, raw anger that I recognized because it was the kind of honest rage that can be redirected into something useful. He agreed to meet me once, with Sam present, at a coffee shop that smelled of espresso in winter. He was younger than I expected, clean-cut, desperate not to become the tragedy of his own life. He listened without theatrics. Afterwards, he said simply, "If what you say is true, I don't want to be the next name on her page." We needed him to be willing to stand where I could not yet stand alone. I was not recruiting him for revenge so much as for truth. His presence would be a wrench in the tight machine they'd been running, two people pretending to be something they were not. He agreed to be part of the plan, not as a co-conspirator in humiliation, but as a man who wanted honesty in his life. Meanwhile, the private investigator found threads I had not expected. Victoria's public persona, decorated with smiling photos, testimonials, and a LinkedIn profile full of polished paragraphs, had creases. There were meetings that made little sense for a therapist with a public practice, transactions that felt private and repeated. Sam's report was sober and clinical. It listed dates, times, and places in a way that removed all the theatricality of betrayal and made it a dry sequence of documented events. I remember the day I sat across from Vivian with a thick folder of printed pages. The attorney's office felt like a courtroom of quiet. Vivian's glasses caught the light, and she tapped a pen on the paper before she spoke. "We can proceed two ways," she said. "You can quietly file for divorce, close the account, move forward, or you can make the misconduct public in a way that protects others and creates leverage for a stronger settlement. Both have costs." I had been cultivating a righteous fury for months. Fury, coolly applied, is a powerful tool. I wanted to ensure that Marcus couldn't simply fold me into a story of private pain and move on with his life intact. I wanted leverage not for vindictiveness, but for safety and a sense that the scales might at least balance for a moment. Vivian explained the legal ramifications in measured tones. She didn't promise dramatic consequences. She advised timing, options for alimony conversations, and the steps needed to file an ethics complaint against a professional who misrepresented herself. She also warned me about the emotional cost of public exposure. That warning is important because we rarely talk about the ways justice costs the person who seeks it. Going public would mean exposing intimate details. It would mean people would look at me and touch my arm in public and say, tenderly, "I'm so sorry." It would mean ink on paper, spotlight light, and a community's murmurs. It would mean my life was no longer private in a way that is not entirely comfortable. I thought of the miscarriage and the nights I lay awake with my palms on my belly, feeling a hollow where a future had been, of the one place in the world where I had allowed myself to be vulnerable. I thought of the fragile things we hand to each other with faith and the way faith can be taken without consent. I'd lost something tangible. I wasn't going to hand over everything else quietly. So we planned. Not in the florid way people write about revenge, no dramatic monologues or glaring lights, but in spreadsheets and timetables and tiny human acts. I began to set the table for a dinner I already knew would be shared. One extra plate remained in the china cabinet that I had not planned to use. I took it out and set it at the head of the table because symbolism matters. I bought a set of wrapping paper in muted green and wrapped a rigid envelope in it, the shape deliberate. Inside would be documents. Inside would be a decision disguised as a present. We rehearsed stories. I practiced being the forgiving wife who wanted to move forward. I played hostess at parties where nerves were the real seasoning. Marcus complimented me on how gracious I'd been. It was a strange compliment, knowing the thing he complimented was a mask I wore on purpose. He saw the surface. He had no idea of the scaffolding beneath. There is a cruelty in pretending all is well, but there is also power. Power is not the same as cruelty. Power is the ability to take control of the narrative that has been stolen from you and to return pieces of it in a way that pays attention to future consequences. I was determined that any harm I brought to him would be proportional and framed within the law. He would feel the social fallout and the legal consequences, yes, but he would not be the sole proprietor of my sadness. The weeks until Christmas contracted like an old calendar you try to fold flat. I made salads, wrapped the extra gifts in tissue paper, and left the divorce folder in my nightstand, its edges like a little secret. Sam kept feeding me facts. Alex replied to texts with thin-line anger and an occasional, "I can't believe this." Vivian drafted versions of motions that looked like stationery at first glance, but held in them the power to change a life. Marcus, in his obliviousness, did what people who cheat often do. He doubled down on the performance. He talked about bringing everyone together and how a big family Christmas could be a healing thing. He didn't understand that some things cannot be healed by ham and holiday small talk. He didn't understand that the most effective revelation is a mirror placed in a bright room. He did not expect I would build the room. I practiced small things, the way to pour wine without shaking too much, the right smile for a toast, the timing of a laugh. Lauren came over and pinned little things in place, a sprig of holly here, a stack of plates there, her hands working like prayers. She was the sister who steadied me while I steeled myself. "You don't have to do this," she said one night, voice clipped with worry. "You can just leave." I wanted to leave. Every part of me wanted to pick up my suitcase and walk out while he turned to his life and wondered why I'd left. But leaving is not justice. Leaving is an act of survival sometimes. This I knew. I wanted more than survival. I wanted reparation of a kind the law can help with, and not just for me, but for any woman who might cross Victoria's path thinking she was an ally. The plan, simple in its ugliness, was to expose them with incontrovertible evidence, to do so in a public setting where lies would be harder to re-stitch, and to present Marcus with the papers, divorce documents, unwrapped like a banal holiday gift, so that the humiliation had a legal and emotional finality. I wanted his choices to have consequences that could not be ironed away with weekend apologies. There is a brutality in that clarity. I am not proud of the hurt I wanted him to feel. I am not proud of how satisfying it was to imagine him stripped of social pretense. But there is a strange solidarity in seeing your hurt acknowledged. So I did what I had to do. Recruiting Alex had been the first real break in their small world. When he agreed to be present, saying he wanted honesty, not spectacle, it felt like the alignment of a moral axis. He wouldn't be the dramatic foil who screamed or cried for television. He simply agreed to be there at the right time, to ask the right question, and to be the sort of witness that papers and testimony sometimes need. We planned the exact entrance. I am not going to tell you the mechanics.
I will tell you the feeling. It is a strange, luminous terror to know that the thing you have built for months could either reveal itself beautifully or collapse into a messy spectacle. I wanted it to be clear, cold, legal, and painfully undeniable. I wanted the truth to be the thing standing at the center of the room. The week before Christmas, there was a storm of domestic chores. I cleaned the house until the counter shone like glass. I polished the silver until my hands were sore. At night, I would sit with the divorce folder and imagine drawing a clean line through our life that would scar and then heal. I began to paint again because paint is how I make sense of ruptures. Color is how I name an emotion that words cannot hold. Marcus continued to float unaware. He picked up an extra bottle of wine at the store, talked loudly about the family coming together. On the Tuesday before Christmas, he mentioned casually over breakfast, "Remember to set an extra place. She'll need a place." I said, okay, because to say no would be to blow the carefully controlled environment I had been maintaining. To refuse would have given away the very ammunition I needed. The night before the dinner, I wrapped the envelope in muted paper and left it under the tree. It was not festive, it was ceremonial. I told myself, in the small, private way one talks to a mirror, that this was not about vengeance. It was about stopping a pattern that had been allowed to continue. I thought of other women who had whispered to me at neighborhood functions, confessions about strained marriages, hints of affairs. I thought of the quiet kindnesses I'd been given and how quietly we had also been permitted to be harmed. I thought of my miscarried child, a thing without a name that had been shushed instead of held. I slept badly. In the dark of my bedroom, I rehearsed lines, the way to steady my voice, the words that feel like steel when you need them. I had to make sure I was capable of carrying the aftermath. The law could do its work, but my heart would still need mending. On Christmas Eve morning, the house smelled like cinnamon and pine. I spent the day arranging candles, rehearsing smiles, and practicing sympathy. The table was set with the extra place card, the wrapped envelope under the tree like a quiet relic. Marcus was bustling in his oblivion. He texted me a picture of a new tie he'd bought for the dinner, happy in his own world. At dusk, I put on the dress I had worn for our anniversary, not out of nostalgia, but as armor. There's a certain poetic cruelty in returning to the scene of the first betrayal in the same garment. I pinned a brooch my grandmother had given me to the lapel to steady my heart.
Guests began to arrive, Lauren with her kids, James with a bottle of bourbon, neighbors whose faces I knew. We laughed, we toasted, we performed the ritual of family. The tree lights winked like tiny eyes. I felt the performance settle into me like a second skin. When the doorbell rang later that night, it sounded like a knell. I stood up with a smile practiced in the mirror and opened the door. He said it, Marcus, casual as sin. She's joining us for Christmas dinner. I set my face in the perfect shape of polite surprise. My voice that night was syrup on razor. Inside me, everything that had been cataloged and cataloged again moved like an army making a final march toward a chosen point. The person who stood in the threshold with a smile that reached her eyes was Victoria. Her hair arranged with the exact confidence of someone accustomed to being seen as safe, a dress the color of evergreen that made her look at home in the soft gold of the room. She was, in public life, everything she said she was. She had the glossy aura of a woman who had curated her image with intention. To everyone else, she was probably simply a guest who had come to mend old ties. To me, she was an accumulation of choices. She smiled at me as one woman does at another when untroubled by the possibility of collision. I welcomed her with a smile big enough for photographs. The children ran under the table, and the adults began to chatter as people do when cups are full and music is low. Conversation moved around the room like a warm current. No one noticed the tremor under my fingertips as I poured the drinks. This is where I end a part I will tell you tonight. This is the moment before ignition, when the tree lights glow and a woman sits at a table that will become a small theater of truth. I am steady on the outside. I have practiced charm and composure like a liturgy. Men who think themselves generous will speak, and no one will suspect that a document, wrapped like a banal gift and heavy with legal language, waits to be unfolded. I am standing at the head of the table in a dress that once meant love. My heart pounds only enough to remind me I am alive. Around us, the room breathes. The door has opened. The last small acts of the set are in motion. I will tell you what happened next and why that single sentence, "She's joining us for Christmas dinner," became the hinge on which the rest of my life turned. But not yet. For now, listen to the clink of glasses and the faint hum of the tree. Breathe with me. The reveal is coming, and with it a reckoning I have waited months to witness. The door clicked closed, and the room folded itself into a portrait of normalcy. Small talk resumed like a band picking up the chorus. Children chased each other's laughter under the table. Someone complimented the roast. Marcus lifted his glass and made a small practiced toast about family and forgiveness. The words were soft. My mouth made them align with the tablecloth. My hands were steady enough to pour wine. Then Alex walked in. He did not burst, he did not shout. He came as a man who had been given a folder and a choice and decided his choice would be quiet and exact.
He stopped at the threshold with a look I had seen in the coffee shop, raw, honest, not performative. He had a coat over his arm and his phone in his hand. He did not smile at Victoria the way the rest of the room did. He looked at her, and the smile he withheld was the first honest thing in the room. There is a small particular sound real confrontations make. It is the sudden lowering of small talk, like the air pressure shifting before a storm. Conversations thin out. People notice how a spoon has been turned in the wrong direction. Victoria's laugh faltered. Marcus's toast clung to the crystal like a stuck note and then popped awkwardly. Alex sat at the table across from Victoria as if his body were a witness stand. He folded his hands. He did not point. He did not shout. He produced a single envelope and laid it between them like a professional prop. The envelope was plain. It was not theatrically wrapped. It did not need to be. "What is this?" Marcus asked, trying at first to salvage a civilized rhythm. His face was the color of someone caught mid-acting, beginning to lose their hold on the part. Alex ignored the question. He opened the envelope and read, and the room contracted around the motion. He read a few lines aloud, small factual sentences that required no flourish, dates, places, messages described without adjectives. His voice was steady in that way people's voices get when they have chosen to be honest and are no longer apologizing for the truth. Victoria's face changed, not with guilt, but with the precise, trained panic of someone whose curated identity has cracks. The therapist's composure that had been her brand, those even, calming tones, thinned into a scratch of fear. She reached for a reply and found her words folded into something smaller than herself. My part was quiet. I had practiced the tilt of my head so many times my neck remembered the geometry. I let Alex speak. I let the printed pages do what pages do. They carry facts, and facts are stubborn. The children watched. The neighbor's eyes widened, and Marcus's expression moved through micro-gestures I had memorized during the months of collection. First confusion, then a quick panicked defense, then a thin attempt at damage control. "Is this," he began, and his voice thinned, trying to be rational, "is this about the past? Are you sure?" "Marcus," I said. It's odd how one small word can stop a machine. My voice, when I used it, was not shrill. It was cold as a blade. People who have been betrayed long and devise a plan for consequence learn to speak in sentences that do not carry heat. Heat tilts toward chaos. Coldness tends to the result. Marcus looked at me like he had not prepared for my face to be a courtroom. Alex continued, and as he did, more names and dates and places landed between them like legal tender. He read what the private investigator had uncovered, that Sam had been careful enough to keep clinical. Confirmed meetings, receipts, messages timed to nights I had been alone. He presented facts the way a doctor presents a diagnosis, lean, necessary, not venomous. He was not performing revenge, he was reporting truth. Victoria rose when she saw the direction of things. She moved with a woman who has practiced exits. She said sorry, words that had been economized into a bundle of contrition, and she tried to explain herself with a calm that had been rehearsed in many mirrors. A few guests muttered. A cousin crossed her arms. My sister's hand found mine like a support beam. When it came to Marcus, the part of him that had believed he could be generous and avoid consequence crumpled. He sputtered apologies and rationalizations that would have been comic if the scene had not been so aching. He called my pain a misunderstanding. He attempted to frame the messages as something he could control after the fact, as if adult damage can ever be sewn up with tidy language. I stood. The room tilted into an angle by my motion. Everyone turned because when I stood, they knew I was no longer part of the performance. On the small coffee table, the envelope I had wrapped and left under the tree sat like a quiet verdict. I reached for it and held the corner of the paper like the end of a ribbon. Transfer, unfolded. I did not make a speech. Great speeches are for movies. This was legal theater. Measured, factual, undeniably visible. I slid the divorce papers across the table toward Marcus. He saw the top page and the color drained from his face like a towel soaking up water. He stammered, "You can't," and then his words became thin. People hold on to language when they can't hold on to integrity. "No," I said, and this time my voice contained a simple, absolute motion. "Open it." He opened the top sheet like someone revealing a menu, expecting to choose between items rather than sentences that end a life he had built.
The paper said petition for divorce. It had a lawyer's letterhead. It had dates and clauses and the signature of Vivian Porter, whose name I had dirtied my mouth to say months before in an office smelling of coffee and order. Marcus read and then looked up, and for the first time that night, he did not try to negotiate emotions. Instead, he looked at me with the stark shock of a man who thought he had made life a puzzle he could arrange. He had misread the edges. He had thought my silence was submission. He had mistook planning for weakness. Victoria surged, indignation flaring like a cheap stage effect. She accused me of public spectacle. She accused Alex of manipulation. She accused us of cruelty. Her accusations had the brittle theatricality of a person who has built a persona on authority and empathy and now finds those brands used against her. Alex did not argue.
He simply slid a printout of messages across, and where words had seemed abstract, they were suddenly clinical. They were the things no amount of apology could change, times he had promised and not been present, nights when words had been shared that belonged only to us, the slow, patient architecture of a betrayal that is not a thunderbolt, but a groundwater that shifts the foundations. Marcus tried to laugh at one moment, a nervous spasm of humor meant to break a tension he could no longer contain. The laugh died in his throat. My neighbor's husband looked at Marcus with a compassion that felt like a verdict. The room split into an odd geography, those who saw me as a woman defending herself, and those who squinted to imagine what they would do in my place. It ended not with a shout, but with a sudden, decisive exit. Victoria left first, pulling her coat on with the speed of someone escaping heat. Her apology turned into a whisper as she passed me. She did not meet my eyes. She headed for her car with a quick, joyless step. Marcus stood, muttering things that meant less and less, and then he left too. He shut the door behind him in a way people do when they are walking out of the life they have been careless about. The room remained. So did the soup bowls and the children's toys. For a moment, the normal textures of home felt absurd, like stage props abandoned when the curtain is pulled. Lauren pulled me toward the kitchen, and I let her. I sat at the counter and put my head in my hands and let the sound of the tree hum like an exhausted engine, my face wet from something that felt like both grief and relief. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words not nearly big enough. She wrapped her arms around me, steady, certain, like a sister does when you have come home bleeding from a place that is private and raw. James called later to ask if he should come back. He offered to take the kids. People offered practicalities because it is what neighbors do when the altar of domestic life splinters. The immediate fallout was a mess of logistics and paperwork. Marcus sent a few messages, first pleading, then bargaining, then angry. I did not reply. I let Vivian do the speaking that night. The law, like medicine, is a profession of process, forms, affidavits, waiting periods. We moved within those structures that promised an outcome more measured than the rawness of the kitchen that night. The next weeks were medically prosaic and emotionally volcanic. The neighborhood was small, Atlanta suburb, the kind where everyone knows your kid's school and what casserole you bring. Rumors did what rumors always do. They traveled fast and tinctured people's assumptions. I was careful about what I said. I wanted my truth to be the loudest thing, not the rumor mill's embellishments. There were calls and emails. Some were tender, offering meals and rides. Others were quiet, polite avoidance. People asked me how I was with the same voice they use when they ask how the weather is. It was necessary. It was allowed. I needed to collect myself. I needed the physical certainty of legal steps to shield me from the endless loop of what-ifs. We filed. The divorce moved through months like slow machinery. Vivian negotiated terms that would protect my financial future and ensure some measure of accountability. I was not interested in cruelty. I wanted fairness and protection. We reached a settlement that, in the ways settlements do, left some things imperfect and other things sufficient.
He signed. We split assets. The house became an object of negotiation rather than a shrine of memory. The process was anticlimactic in the administrative way of grown-up resolution, numbers, signatures, not the cathartic climax people expect from novels. Victoria faced professional consequences in the measured way institutions respond when someone who claims to uphold family values is accused of violating them. Vivian helped me file a formal complaint with the relevant board. The board opened an inquiry. They requested documents. I handed over the evidence Sam had compiled. They sent letters and scheduled hearings. I cannot sit here and swear to what sanction would follow because institutional reviews are procedural and sometimes ambiguous. I can say that an inquiry was opened, that clients contacted the practice, that pieces of her curated life began to wobble. People who curate identities for trustworthiness suffer when that trust is demonstrably breached. The consequences arrived as a loss of clients, a professional scrutiny that is uncomfortable for anyone who built a life around being safe and helpful. There were other social consequences, too. Marcus's colleagues gave him the polite distance the social world has for people who've been publicly unmasked as unfaithful. Friends who had been convenient spectators moved away from the center of our lives. It stung in small human ways, dinner invitations that no longer came, birthday cards that transitioned from warmth to awkward notes. The social ledger is a currency we rarely want to name until it is taken away from us. Then you learn what people were investing in and why. There was also, in the rubble, a strange flood of support. Women I barely knew messaged me, similar stories, shorter losses, confessions that had been kept like tiny, bitter seeds. Some were private. "I'm dealing with something similar," they would write. Others wanted to tell me their own stories publicly, to step into the light and name the things they had been told to hide. From the wreckage came a belonging I had not expected. When you are publicly hurt, people often crowd you, not to make it worse, but to make it understood. Therapy began a different kind of repair. My first session, I sat and described the months like one might recite a medical history, dates, incidents, effects. The therapist listened without astonishment. There is a particular mercy in being heard without fixative, no platitudes, no punditry, just a witness who holds space. We talked about miscarriage and the way trauma becomes a shadow in your chest. We spoke of trust as a muscle that might be rebuilt slowly. We spoke of shame and how people internalize betrayal and then perform their own disappearance as penance. Recovery was irregular. It did not look like a montage of jogging at sunrise and smiling through watercolor classes. It was messy. I cried in the grocery aisle. I laughed at the wrong moments. I sat at my kitchen island and wept for the child I'd never meet. I felt guilt for feeling relief that a lie was out, for the satisfaction of seeing the scales tip in any direction. In therapy, I learned to accept that grief and anger are not mutually exclusive, that the two may coexist and be tended to rather than battled. One of the first concrete acts of reclamation was small. I repainted the guest room. The paint color was a defiant, unremarkable beige at first, then a brighter turquoise, then a calming gray. The room's walls were a timeline of my interior life. Painting was a thing that used my hands and gave me a visible, touchable alteration to the landscape of the house. I painted alone at odd hours and left the radio on. I learned that physical labor has the power to anneal internal scars. I also began to run. I used to run in the afternoons on quiet streets where the magnolias scent the air like a perfume machine gone wrong. Running cleared the static in my head. It was not about fitness at first. It was about moving my body through space that had been rendered poisonous by memory. My GPS tracked my miles. My legs learned the cadence of a life that required movement. Work became another axis of return. I threw myself into my creative practice, commissioned pieces, gallery calls, a local show. Paintings sell in waves and sometimes struggle in valleys. They are not a sure cradle, but the work fed a part of me that betrayal had hollowed out, a voice. I began to write more, less in a diary and more in long, deliberate essays about what it meant to reclaim narrative after someone else wrote a lie into it. I wrote about being a Black wife in an Atlanta suburb and the odd mix of intimacy and scrutiny that position entails. The words found readership. People resonated with the specifics, the modest "I feel you" in a peculiarly Southern social fabric. There was recognition in those details, and tenderness, and sometimes fury. The media did knock a little, nothing dramatic, but a local paper asked some questions that required answers. I placed a few boundaries, what to say, what to keep private. There is a temptation to let the story become larger than you, to get drunk on the power of being the protagonist in other people's narratives. I kept a steady guard on what I disclosed because the point was not to be famous. The point was to establish a life that was honest and protected. Over the months, small public acts memorialized my recovery. I spoke at a small panel about betrayal and mental health. Women stood up afterward and talked about their secret pains. Someone told me later that the panel had been a turning point for them, the first time they realized they could name the thing that had been eroding their life. That is what finally felt like recompense, not the humiliation of one man, but the opening of a space where other people could be safer because the lie had been exposed. It did not mean pain disappeared. There were anniversaries that felt like blades. There were holidays where I replaced plates of food with single invitations to friends who understood. But the sharpness dulled with time, like a well-used knife. You learn to live around the mark. There were legal odds and ends. The divorce became final in an ordinary way. Signatures, a clerk's stamp, a date that my lawyer told me to remember. The settlement protected me financially and professionally enough to rebuild without fear of destitution. Marcus had to confront the social and financial consequences of his choices. The exact mechanics of that are legal and mundane, a distribution of assets, a division of accounts. The important thing in the story was not the arithmetic, but the message. Choices have consequences that reach farther than the bedroom. Victoria, as the board's inquiry unfolded, lost clients and credibility. Some of her professional associations distanced themselves. A handful of people wrote letters claiming they had been misled. The details of that process are institutionally interminable. What matters is that her life, once curated with the cool authority of therapy quotes and staged family photos, changed into one where trust had to be rebuilt or abandoned. I never took joy in someone else losing livelihood. I took measure in seeing the misalignment between persona and performance acknowledged. Perhaps the most curious part of recovery was the way my identity shifted. Being a Black wife of my neighborhood had been part of my daily truth. People knew my family, where my children played, the church where my mother sang. That identity had been intertwined with the role of being steady and reliable. After the unraveling, I still held that identity, but it moved. I became a Black woman who had told a difficult truth and lived to call it mine. I found in that truth a new relationship to community. Some folks leaned in, others flinched, but the people I wanted, my sister, my neighbor who brought casseroles, friends who kept their arms open, those people stayed. They were the ones who mattered. Writing the book felt like the most audacious and then the most necessary act of reclamation. The first draft came out of a long night of insomnia, notes, images, the same sentences I had rehearsed. I wrote not to indict, but to explain and to connect. I wrote about the miscarriage and the silence that follows such loss, about the small betrayals that compound into a life's disruption. I wrote about the ethics of exposure, the moral finger towards people who hurt others for convenience. I wrote about being allowed to be angry and also allowed to heal. I published a collection of essays that folded memory into analysis. The book was honest and not melodramatic. It resonated. Maybe part of its success was timing. The world was primed to hear stories of women who reclaimed narrative. Maybe part was the honesty, that I did not celebrate violence, but I did insist on accountability. The book sold more than I expected. It was reviewed in a few places, and a reporter called me a voice of the resilient. I laughed at that. Resilience is not an accolade, it's a survival strategy. The book led to work I had not anticipated, invited talks, a small consulting partner who wanted to build a nonprofit for women navigating betrayal and legal recourse, and a network that pooled resources for women who could not afford attorneys. This was perhaps the most precious outcome. Out of my wound, other women could shoulder less of the burden. We set up a hotline list of vetted attorneys and therapists in the city. We organized workshops that taught women how to gather and document evidence legally and ethically, how to find supportive therapy, how to begin again without feeling they had to shoulder shame. We were careful in everything we did, always emphasizing legal routes and professional help, and never instruction for illicit actions. Our ethos was practical and moral, to offer help and to insist that accountability need not be cruel. There were smaller joys, too. I traveled for the first time since the miscarriage, just a short trip to Charleston to breathe salt air with a friend who had stood by me. I opened a small studio space above a bookstore where I could paint and meet clients. I dated in a way that was tentative and honest. I found men who asked about my days and listened not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. I existed in a series of firsts that felt both tentative and bold. When people ask me now if the reveal was worth it, I no longer answer with a single word. There were costs and benefits. The public exposure meant my life was no longer private in some ways. The humiliation was a sharp, public thing. There were nights when the smell of pine would take me back to that table and my throat would ache. There were, undeniably, women who think a public unmasking is spectacle and who wished I had chosen quietness. I respect that. The moral calculus of exposure is private and heavy. But there is one thing I can say without hesitation. I would not trade back the autonomy I gained. The life I have now is not the life I had before, but it is a life I chose for myself. The years that followed were not a single redemption arc, but a slow painting. I learned to paint with a new color, a gold thread that stitches a crack. I have a canvas in my studio where the center is a healed seam. People who know kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing pottery with gold, understand the metaphor. Breakage is not always about loss. It can be about newness. I painted a thin gold line across the work, and there it is every day, reminding me that things can be repaired and still show the history of what was done. My sister married the following year and asked me to stand up beside her. I wore a dress with a subtle gold brooch, something that belonged to our grandmother, and felt whole in a way that was not childish. My armor had softened into jewelry. I watched my niece and nephew at the ceremony with a contentment that felt earned. Being a Black wife is still part of my identity, but it is a chapter, not a definition. There is a finality in my telling the story, an ending that does not pretend to be neat. Marcus lives his life with his own set of consequences. Victoria's professional life rearranged itself in indeterminate ways. The law did its portion, and the community did its portion. And I kept breathing, and I kept making things. I wrote more books. I kept the nonprofit small and effective.
I met women in kitchens who whispered the secrets they had kept for decades, and sometimes, if it felt right, they told me the next day that they had made a call. The conversations mattered more than any single victory. If there is a moral to be gleaned from the rubble, it is this: silence is not always nobility. Sometimes silence shelters the wrong thing. If your peace depends on erasure, if your marriage is quiet because you have been asked to disappear, then power is not the same as love. I wanted accountability, not revenge. I wanted to stop a pattern, not to be praised for public spectacle. I wanted to heal. And so, if you find yourself in a small kitchen with an ordinary word, "She's joining us for Christmas dinner," know that words are doors. They can invite you into the ordinary, or they can open into something else. I chose to open that door and let the light in, not to blind, but to illuminate. If this story resonates with you, if you have been hurt and wondered how to find your footing, know there are legal professionals, therapists, and communities ready to help. If you'd like to read more about the process, how I rebuilt my life and started the nonprofit, and where we find resources, my book and links are in the description. Consider subscribing and sharing your own story in the comments. Your truth may be the light someone else needs. I close with a picture that is simple and stubborn. Me in my studio, brush in hand, painting a slender gold line across a cracked vase. The line is not a lie. It is not armor. It is a new seam, visible, honest, and beautiful. It is what remains when you refuse to let betrayal define the shape of your life.